I don't think evolution through natural selection, it doesn't maximize for valent states or happiness or the things that we, for that matter, value. Like it maximizes for survival in the end of the day. And I think what we might find out as we are engaging in that truth seeking is that, wow, connected to all this type of new physics or new exotic states of consciousness that are, exciting and fulfilling, and we can optimize them just for its own sake. We don't have to do it in a way where we are victims to our Darwinian hardwiring, where we need to seek power. We need to have a strong ego. We need to do all of those things because they're adaptive for our survival. But we can finally sort of bootstrap away from that hardwiring and leverage physics in a way that is truly awesome.
This is Daniel Fagelli. You're tuned in to The Trajectory. This is episode 9 of our Worthy Successor series, where we talk about defining the kind of AGI that we would want to take the baton and rule the future. This episode started with a philosopher and thinker by the name of Nick Bostrom, who many of you would know. Many of you might not know that working closely with him during the writing of Superintelligence, a book for which many people know him, how he sort of entered the mainstream in many people's minds, he was paired up with Kristian Rönn, who is working at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. Kristian is a thinker and author of a book called The Darwinian Trap, which I recommend. Previously started a company called Normative, is now working on AI hardware governance and has moved to San Francisco. He has a lot of interesting thoughts around where artificial general intelligence should go, and especially sort of the competitive dynamics between labs, between states, and what it might take to get to solidarity so that we could kind of move closer, not just to an arms race, but to an actual worthy successor. Lots of interesting kind of governance dynamics towards the end of this episode, and lots of interesting talk around consciousness and its valuable qualities in the beginning of this talk. I will save my commentary for the end as usual. Without further ado, let's fly right in. This is Kristian Rönn here in The Trajectory. So Kristian, welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot for having me. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Oh man, we've been itching to really get into the good stuff ever since catching up in Paris, and today we're finally going to be able to do it. So, Worthy Successor was a series that kicked off with that great colleague of yours, Nick Bostrom, a little bit under a year ago when that episode went live. Obviously, you worked with him very directly, and he's influenced your work among other thinkers. And so I'll ask you the same question as we kick the series off, and this is going to start unraveling the rest of your ideas. The main question is what the qualities and traits are of a worthy successor. The way I always ask it is pretend, you're 10,000 years in the future. You're just a transparent observer of the universe. Maybe Earth, it could just be the Milky Way or even broader. You're looking down and there are no more humans left. It's been, whether it's wiped out or evolved or whatever, there's no, what you and I look like, it's not there. But as you look down, you say, this turned out really well. This is one of the best scenarios that could have happened from what Earth life was. Talk to me about what that scenario would look like for you in detail.
Yeah. I can sort of first maybe talk about what would the characteristics of that worthy successor be, and then we can sort of unravel what would be a causal chain that would sort of bring us to those characteristics.
Yes.
But I think I would sort of like to divide it into the different branches of philosophy almost.
All right. No one's ever done this.
Right? Yeah. Which is how do you gain knowledge as effectively as possible? So I think a worthy successor would be someone that is maximally truth-seeking. There is actually mathematical results around what such an agent looks like. So there is something called Solmonov induction that sort of brings you to truth the fastest way possible, at least theoretically. Turns out that it's not computable. So I think something that is a high like order approximation of Solomon-off induction being maximally truth-seeking is one such characteristic. Another branch of philosophy is ethics, and namely normative ethics. Like, what is it that we're actually trying to optimize for? So I think a worthy successor would be someone that is trying to optimize around the maximum well-being, happiness, valence of sentient beings, and trying to minimize suffering. And I think the third point is a metaphysical one. And I think this is actually the most important one that I would like there to be more discourse around. And that's what is an agent of moral concern in the first place? Like, what is the self? What is the personal identity? And I think a worthy successor here would be someone that feels radically in tuned with the well-being of all sentient beings. Because if you look at all of the problems that we're facing today, everything from AI arms races to nuclear arms races, to a whole host of problems, also in our evolutionary history, like cancer and viruses, they're all versions of defection. And defection from a game theoretical perspective, if you have the tragedy of the commons or the prisoner's dilemma, it is all about how do you perceive yourself as an agent? You perceive yourself as something distinct from everything else.
Yeah.
And if that is dissolved, and I think it's a necessity for that to be somewhat dissolved for a worthy successor to exist in the future, because I think the current sort of evolutionary states are not stable. And I think in order to have a stable sort of evolutionary state, you need to think about future generations. You need to care about future generation and other beings. And in order for that to really work, you sort of need to dissolve that ego or illusion of personal identity to some regard.
So we've got truth seeking and sort of able to access truth, and we'll get into what a little bit more on that. We've got an ethics that we could say at least has a strong utilitarian component, right? And of course, there's many permutations of utilitarianism, though it's very, a single sentence phrases it real nice, but you get into the specific types of utilitarianism and their consequences of utility monsters and things like that, and it starts to get a little wonky. But for you, in general, just dialing into sentience being super important as a kind of ethical normative thing, really important for you as well. And then thirdly, said entity would sort of, I guess, my assumption is your interpretation of this is it would recognize its inherent oneness, rather than your interpretation being it would see itself as being one with other entities, whether it is or not. Well, I think what you're suspecting is there is an inherent oneness. Am I picking up correctly on those 3 points?
Yeah, I would say so. I think the second point, I don't think it necessarily have to be utilitarian. I mean, I think like you can model any sort of preference as a utility function, right? So, I mean, it could, for instance, include preferences for, personal freedom or other things like that. And I think it's sort of an interesting result that any ethical theory could be like turned into a consequentialist theory.
Certainly.
As soon as you have a preference ordering of things, you can derive an arithmetic around it.
Yes.
And certain like consequences. So I would say that it's, at least me personally, I care about the happiness of all sentient beings, but I'm not so narrow in my definitions. So I think my sort of definition allows for a plurality of other ethical theories as well.
Got it. Okay. So, and I'm going to, this is kind of setting some of these foundational Lego pieces as we sort of build a little bit higher here. An entity that had those traits, and we're going to dive back in and we're going to look at these pillars individually and sort of pick things apart. I'll play devil's advocate in some cases, but I'm firmly understanding these kind of 3 cores that for you feel like those are going to be fundamental parts of what this thing is in an ultimate sense. And that all clicks for me here. Based on that, let's just say such an entity emerged. Maybe it was straight up from artificial superintelligence. Maybe there was a lot of kind of brain-computer interface merger type stuff that led up to this thing, and human simulated sentiences are swimming within it like cells within a greater organism? I don't really know. Well, actually, so I was going to say, okay, however it bubbles up, what does it look like? But actually, I should ask you, what do you consider to be most likely to be the way that it would bubble up? Like, do you suspect primarily this grander thing will mostly be just purely non-biological? Do you see a little bit of merger at the beginning or at the end? I mean, what is your thought about the likely blossoming? If it should go well, how will it likely blossom in your mind?
I think it would most likely be non-biological. And then obviously I have sort of personally a probability distribution over the different ethical theories being true. So for instance, I would hate for it to be non-biological if it turns out that only biological beings are, capable of sentience
Certainly.
through like microtubules in the brain or something like that. I don't think that is true, but I have like a probability distribution over different scenarios here. But I think most likely it's going to be non-biological. I think it's very unlikely that our current biological configuration is the most efficient one and the most efficient way of spreading like novel valent states of qualia into the universe. So I think it's most likely going to be non-biological and most likely some exotic form of computation, even going beyond like traditional von Neumann architecture. It's like probably something that we haven't even considered in the first place. Maybe quantum in nature.
I would be blown away to the point of disbelief if it were anything we could personally imagine. Just as this conversation is vastly beyond the imagination of our next sort of highest ancestor on the primate chain, right?
Yeah.
But yes, your suppositions would likely be non-biological. So let's just say said non-biological entity blooms, and it may be entities. Some people think a singleton is likely, some people don't. We've done some interesting polls on that. Regardless, you're looking down. It's had these traits which feel like the bedrock for you of like what would give it the chance of blasting off. It's been a non-biological kind of takeoff. You're looking down. What does that look like on Earth? What does that look like in the Milky Way? What does that look like in the multiverse? Maybe I'm not going to put any limitations on your imagination here, but just as you look down as that observer into the multiverse, there's no humans, but like, wow, this is just such a good situation. What is happening for you?
Yeah, I think there is sort of the outside materialist view. I mean, I think what it will look like is essentially like all matter being turned into some sort of computers or some sort of computation, like that are simulating minds that are living fulfilled lives. But then on the inside, like I don't fully know what that will look like. And it's the inside that I care about, right? Like it sounds super boring and a little bit dystopian if I'm just, okay, everything in the universe is just like one boring computer. But like my brain also looks really fucking boring when I look at it from the outside.
From the outside, extremely boring looking, yeah.
Really, really exciting, like I have all of these emotions and interesting states of consciousness. So I think on the inside, it's very hard for me to predict what it will look like. But I think it will be radically different from what we perceive, because I think the space of all possible qualia is probably infinite. And it's probably some infinite, combinatoric of possible computations. So there's probably infinite permutations out there, but we are just perceiving this small sliver that is there to maximize for our overall survival.
Of course.
And it turns out that we don't need to see the full electromagnetic spectrum in order to survive. We just need to see this small, tiny thing. Yeah. And I think the same thing applies for all other possible types of dimensions as well. I mean, we see ourselves, it might be that, time is this extra dimension and everything exists simultaneously, but we're not sort of, capable of perceiving that. And I suspect as well that when everything is turned into a grand unified theory, there it will probably contain like a lot of dimensions and weird things that we cannot even detect, but we can deduce that they exist there because that's the only way our predictive models will work.
Absolutely. So I'm going to drill right down into this. So your vision seems to be, like it's clicking. You got your foundational pillars firing out into the world. Atoms are being converted into some kind of, blissful computronium, very David Pierce style language here, and very rich, diverse, exotic, and you pronounce exotic exactly like Anders does, which is great. Classic Swedish pronunciation of exotic. Yeah. But yeah, lots of interesting, rich permutations of mind and of experience. Again, the stuff that makes life worthwhile for us, but wildly explored in all its fanciful, expanded dimensions in interesting ways, and the universe kind of waking up in that sense, in that kind of expansive and rich qualia computronium sense. Totally clicks. I'm going to dial into some details here. So, Bostrom had kind of brought up, and he's not the only one to have mentioned it, sort of this idea that like, hey, ideally, such an entity would emerge, and it would be really interested in exploring those spaces, but also in preserving sort of existing mind. So it would really be like maybe we've had some other folks kind of talk about maybe we can negotiate with it so that we can have the Earth and then it does other things, or I'm not exactly sure what negotiation looks like with a thing that like is to us what we are to nematodes or whatever. But so I frankly see that as wholly untenable. But this idea that maybe we could negotiate with it, or maybe it would just see us as valuable. It would emerge and say, oh, you entity, human, let's keep you the same way you are. I mean, in all seriousness, human, I could use your atoms and I could build a bliss cube, or I could build, 8,000 sugar cubes of hyper expansive hyper bliss that would literally involve like vastly expansive degrees of joy that would be sort of 7 million orders of magnitude more than what you could ever possibly experience in your entire lifetime. But I won't do that. I'll sacrifice that value because you currently have an opposable thumb and I respect you. Like, what does such an entity, again, do you share Bostrom's notion that it would see a value in us, or it could be negotiated with us for us to maintain our individual instantiations? Like, I know this is an uncouth topic, but this is an uncouth show, my friend. This is a show about like where the goddamn future is likely to go and maybe where it should go, even if it's not always pleasant. What are your thoughts there?
I think I have somewhat contradictory views on that topic, if I'm just being completely honest.
Please, yeah, lay them out there.
One part of me that just thinks humanity is awesome. I mean, I want humanity to survive. Like the thought, I mean, I don't have kids yet, but just the idea of creating a new branch in this beautiful tree of evolution, I think there is something fundamentally beautiful there that I would like to preserve. But then I have also that other, less sentimental, utilitarian mind that is like, okay, my body is probably a waste of a space. There's probably some more efficient configuration that creates more well-being. And as a utilitarian, that should be the direction that we should go in. And I guess what I'm doing here is that I'm acknowledging the fact that, different parts of me could see two different directions when it comes to this. And there might be ways of reconciling those directions, of saying like, hey, let's actually upload your mind and transform it into a way more like efficient configuration. I mean, similar to how you might do with a compiler. You might compile like one sort of less efficient high order language to something, super efficient, like running assembly code. And we could do something similar with my mind, where it still exists the way it is, but it exists in a more efficient configuration, right? So I think that is also like a possible scenario. But what I do want to say and acknowledge is that there is a part of me that wants humanity to be around, and I think there is something beautiful around that. And if space is really, really infinite, then I think there will be enough room for humanity in its current configuration to exist, and I would like that. Yeah.
I think the tough part about asking this question that I always have to be touchy with is like, you risk being seen as a bad person unless you say a lot of the words you just said. But I mean, all of us as humans, I think, genuinely do also have the side where it's like, well, it sure would be cool if my individual instantiation of consciousness was treated well through the transition. The question, I think, is really like, this is a dastardly question to ask, but it's like, should it? So I think there's sort of like, will AI? I think it's often framed as like, will AI care about us? Because obviously that's what's best, but actually I'm not sure it's obvious.
Yeah.
And so I'm just actually not sure, actually. And like, that's disturbing. But I think for me, like, if we're going to hand off the baton, that makes me be even more careful about whatever is built, because if our attenuation sort of follows from there, hopefully not maliciously, it better be carrying the torch of something valuable. To what you've brought up here is obviously, sentient richness and depth beyond measure, right? Is sort of what you've sort of articulated. So let's make sure it's actually holding on to that stuff. We're going to get into in the next question, like, how would we measure if what we're building has those traits you've articulated? But as we're just still unpacking this idea, there's this sort of notion of like, let's just say, my firm suspicion, and by the way, if you can, I'm saying this so that you can walk me off this cliff, by the way. I'd love for you to walk me back from this. But I have only heard childish cope versions of the maybe it'll save Earth for humans argument. Like, they have all struck me as, like, when you look at the stages of grief, they are just bargaining in the way a child would bargain. And I have wished for them, but I have found them wanting. So I suspect there might be a best case where, like, if the individual instantiations of hominid sentience get a good shake, if somehow either we negotiate it or for some weird reason the deity that we conjure believes we're worthy of it, my take would be like, is it better if it leaves Earth alone? Or is it better if it takes all current instantiations of human sentience? So I don't identify as much with my opposable thumb as with the movie playing in my head. And I think you're kind of the same way. You identify a bit more with the movie playing in your head than with your opposable thumbs. Like, if that got uploaded into, and somehow kept the fidelity there, whether it's through Kurzweil's kind of Ship of Theseus or however we do it, it's actually still me. I'm bumped into a sugar cube, and in this sugar cube, I get to spend 7 minutes, but it is a simulated 3 billion years of hyper expansive hyper bliss, and then the sugar cube turns over, somebody else gets loaded into it, everybody gets the vacation. And then finally the AI can just fucking do something useful. But it gives us what I would think of as like I don't have a terminology yet. I've got to write an essay, but like a graceful bowing out, or like the ultimate retirement. I don't know what to call it, but it sort of strikes me as like, is situation A, where we still play around in the world of physics and we get an upset stomach sometimes, we get jealous sometimes, we get heartbroken sometimes, we catch disease. Hopefully it would solve disease, I guess, right? But like, is that better, or is everybody gets a bump better? Like, do you have an instinct on this?
I mean, I think everyone getting a bump, but it's, I guess, like, sort of personal identity and personhood is just like incredibly complicated, because there is a version of all of this where if my atoms gets configured into this new state, I still feel something. It might be different, but I'm still there. And I might even feel like this infinite bliss of being finally reunited with the rest of the universe, with my ego completely dissolved. Like, there is a version where that happens as well. I do want to go back to what you said earlier around
ahead.
like there being a lot of wishful thinking around like Earth existing
man.
as sort of this natural habitat. And I think there is to some extent, right? I think, there are different permutations of the argument. Like, let's say we solve alignment, and that is like unambiguously what all of humanity wants. And then therefore, like the new artificial superintelligence singleton also wants this for us. Then I think it's like slightly more realistic, right? But it's complicated. I mean, just if I introspect myself, like I clearly have contradictory desires on this. Like one want to be like, I want to go back to nature. I want to live in this like human reserve on planet Earth, and I want that to be awesome. Another part of me is like, oh, I want to be a part of this oneness cube where I feel reunited with all other qualia in the universe, transformed into this bigger thing. And okay, now I'm asking the superintelligence to extract and extrapolate my volitions. It will be like, error, does not compute.
Exactly, right?
You need to sort your shit out, work with your parts, because you want contradictory things here. I think like extracting our preferences into one like utility function without any contradictions is probably like next to an impossible task, which doesn't make things easier, right?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't make it easier at all. And I think, again, like the whole, like, I hear arguments, I've heard them 1,000 times on this show and in conversations on Twitter and wherever else. Like, no. The way it's going to work is everyone will just get their own choice. Like, if you want to upgrade your brain, you can do it. If you want to stay a regular human, you'll be able to do it. If you want to get uploaded or like merge with AI or whatever, you could just like do that too. And some people might have like a robo body and a physical body, and like, you get whatever you want. It's like fucking Santa Claus is coming to town. Like they talk like that. And for me, it's like, I have no idea if in the grand fecundity of what is to come, you're just going to get a fucking Chinese menu of what you want, like the totality of the rest of your sentient experience to look like. Like, I'm actually not sure about that. And I'm not, and again, like, it's uncouth to say, I admit it's uncouth to say, but I'm not sure you should. I'm really not. I'm actually not sure you should. Imagine, Kristian, everybody gets to be their own divergent, hyper-upgraded mind. Like, oh, I want to upgrade this part of my mind. I want to add on these capabilities. I want to have this kind of potential, this kind of power, whatever. And then we're all sharing meat space? This entity doesn't even need to value the biosphere. This entity can, like, shoot fucking laser beams that can destroy things. This entity can... It's like, are we all just going to become, like, like individual humans would have the extended phenotype of a fucking city. You're going to have 8 billion of those, like, sharing this planet? Like, it just strikes me as like, I'm just not sure we come out the back end of this. Even if it goes well, I'm not sure we do, and I'm not even certain we ought to. Just based on like what the priorities sort of would be. Like, do you have a non-copy version of like, well, I think the reason we'll all get a choice or we'll all get to pick if we're on the reserve or get uploaded is X? Like, you got anything there?
I honestly think that's fantasy land, because physics will still be physics, and physics has constraints. Like, even though we will have radically more abundance, there will always be trade-offs, like your preferences might not match perfectly with my preferences. And we will, after all, have a limited amount of computation to fulfill specific preferences at any point in time. So there is no way this will work. It breaks physics, it breaks physical laws. Even in a virtual reality, it will still be governed by physics and limitations at a base level. So that means that, if we have contradictory preferences, that at some point in time, we need to choose, like, which direction do we take? And that's where I think, going back to that, like, what is the worthy successor? I think we need to somewhat dissolve the ego here. Because if we all get access to space lasers and dangerous weapons and whatever capabilities, like, we might end up destroying ourselves regardless, because your view of the world with your space lasers is not equivalent to my view of the world. And then there will be a war between the two of us. And that war might entirely destroy the flame of consciousness in the universe. So I think that's why I keep coming back to that sense
the ego
of
thing.
like, we need to sort of dissolve the ego, because it is an illusion to some extent. Like, I am actually a colony of cells, like I am a colony of cells that are all programmed that to act in harmony in some way. And then when they don't, we call that cancer, and it's generally like a really bad thing to have. But I am, as a matter of fact, a collective consciousness in some regard, right? And so I think like how I sort of slice that up is somewhat arbitrary. Like similarly, and I sort of take this quite seriously, that sometime when you get into a conversation with someone from a position of high empathy, you just feel this sense of oneness. And in a sense, you are oneness, because the like boundaries of computation is like quite arbitrary.
Well, let's poke into this. So I'm going to do some like devil's advocating and like under the hooding of just all these different ideas and try to have some fun with it. So this idea of oneness, I think, when you and I talked off microphone, there's this sort of Emersonian notion, and I'm sure it's not his, right? He read the Vedas and all that stuff, and he's not like he's like claiming to have invented it. But the analogy is interesting. We're just different holes punctured in the same canvas. Where like the same light is shining through, but we're just different holes, different size holes, shaped holes, whatever the case may be. And that sort of like undergirding it, there's this conscious layer. I will say, in my personal opinion, that seems like it actually could be pretty plausible. I'll also say I'm not nearly confident about that in any degree of certainty, right? And for me, taking MDMA or whatever could leave Andres and whoever else to be very, very certain about that, I'm just not sure. Like if I drank bleach and it made me like feel like pain and hate everything, I wouldn't be like, oh, I just saw reality. I saw what's real. Everything sucks, right? It's like, no, you just fucking bathed your brain and you felt some random arbitrary shit. You're still a monkey, dog. You don't know everything. And so for me, I don't know if I've accessed reality on mushrooms, and I don't. And if someone did have a mushroom trip and they like believed that like they were a toad and that the world hated them and that they were sitting in lava, like you don't come out of that trip and be like, oh fuck, dude, I know what reality is now. But somehow when you come out of it and it's all happy fucking fun times, you come up with conclusions about what the universe is. And like for me, I don't know if I feel confident about those. So I like this idea of dissolving the ego. And I like this hypothesis of dissolving the ego. I like this hypothesis of sort of a merger with oneness. I think the consequences of that actually are extremely non-anthropocentric, by the way. If we're the light behind the canvas, ooh-wee, bucko, I don't know how valuable that sized hole is anymore. I think it's the light that's valuable, actually. So I think we get into some, let's be real deal. This ain't all about monkeys forever kind of stuff. But like, how certain do you feel about kind of the inherent level of oneness, and where does your sentiment come from? Obviously, you've thought through some of your positions. I mean, what's your take here?
So I think my take here is that it is fundamentally arbitrary where you put the boundaries. So I mean, like, let's say, the development of, the fetus that later grows into a person, like it's just like literally cells in a colony, and there is no sense of, okay, now this is a person and now it's not a person.
Yeah.
It's just cells interacting, doing different types of computation.
It's a process.
I mean, similarly, you could say that, you and me and everyone else building the superorganism of nation states and societies are cells that are doing computations and interacting with each other. So I think like mathematically speaking and scientifically speaking, I don't see any particular reasons to say like, this is the container of the self, and it doesn't extend further than this.
Yeah. Well, my current supposition. So look, I'm totally with you there. I will say the following and feel rather confident in it. And this is the easiest thing to be confident about. I'm not so confident what sentience is.
Yeah.
I'm not so confident where it comes from. I feel very confident saying that. And you would be shocked, maybe you wouldn't, with how many people have told me that they just get it. Like, no, AGI could never be, like, it's just never a thing. And here's why. And they'll say 2 or 3 things. Or like, well, of course it would be conscious. It would be conscious automatically. If you used my framework, you get people with like very, very proud of like their computational breakthroughs. And like, God bless their souls, they're geniuses, right? But like, I don't know if that lets you be confident about consciousness, dog. I don't know if that like now you're fucking around saying that your pet theory is like the real deal. So I share your supposition that like where the lines are drawn, oof, I don't think I know where to draw any lines. I think everything's a wild process made of something I'm unaware of and coming from places I don't know. But that agnosticism around my condition does not allow me to land gracefully like a gymnast on the position of, well, of course we're all of the same light, and if we were just wise enough, we would realize that. And of course, AGI will just get there naturally. I can't land on that one lily pad. There's a million lily pads I can't even imagine that it actually could be. It could be things that neither you or I have the intellectual capacity to land on. This is my sentiment. And so while I very seriously would entertain the notion of this kind of field of sentience of which we're all part in some way, I don't have confidence that A, that's true, or B, that AGI would magically arrive at that conclusion. I would love to understand your degree of confidence.
I completely agree. Like, okay. I completely agree with that. And I think the only reasonable position here is to think about what crucial considerations, what crucial assumptions thus our like ethical theories and strategies depend on, and what is the probability distribution over different hypotheses in those specific domains. So to give like sort of concrete examples here, like for instance, what is qualia? I mean, there is like multiple theories there, and you ought to have a probability distribution over those theories. And then if you sort of divide sort of qualia into like different types of agents or persons and personal identity, like there's a bunch of theories over that. And then you have, for instance, like what are we optimizing for when it comes to these sentient beings? So we now sort of concluded what is the probability distribution of different agents, right? And then you might have, utilitarian deontological theories. So I think the only reasonable way is to sort of map this out and have probability distributions on top of probability distributions. And then you might end up with some sort of extreme scenarios like, S risks, for instance. And I think in general, you ought to apply a precautionary principle here, meaning that I rather prefer to be expansive in terms of what agents exists than the other way around, because then at least I will not create a bunch of unnecessary suffering and S risks and so on. So I think like if you map all of those layers and layers up and multiply all of those probability distributions, you end up with some sort of game theoretical matrix, and in that matrix you want to apply something similar to the precautionary principle. And I feel like there's too many people that are way too certain about those things. And if it was as straightforward as like what is the height of the Eiffel Tower, I mean, I bring that up in my book as an example. Like that is clearly truth convergent. Like we will all converge.
We're all good on that one.
We don't seem to converge on the same thing here. So that makes me feel like, okay, like why should I trust what you're saying over here?
Totally. It seems like let's just admit that we don't really get it. Let's admit that. For me, part of the project of sort of building posthuman intelligence, you talked about being truth-seeking. There's this Spinozan idea of potentia. Potentia is the total set of powers that permit a thing to not die. Presumably consciousness, which you and I value, bubbled up to help some entity way before us, like do some kinds of thinking that made it less likely to perish. And like, thank goodness that thing bubbled up that ability, because like, hey, we're having a conversation and I feel it in my head, and that's great. But Spinoza also has this notion of sort of adequate and inadequate ideas. And adequate ideas are essentially for him like ideas that if you act upon them, they behoove your survival. And presumably, in large part, that means an accurate grasp of the world. An accurate grasp of the world. If you don't know germ theory, if you have an inadequate idea of illness in that regard, you're in trouble. And we were in trouble for a long time. Spinoza himself had an inadequate understanding of what breathing in small chipped pieces of glass would do, because he was a lens grinder, and he died a horrible death, coughing up blood, because his entire era just had an inadequate notion of sort of how lungs worked and how particles worked with the lungs and stuff like that. So like building a lot of adequate ideas and building a deep understanding of things seems to me like there are things like, what is the moon? If you're a monkey, the moon could be, I don't know, it could be like a very bright fruit or something that is like just farther away for you to grasp and you can't get it. And like that's a 3% genetic difference from us, right? But it's like, that's maybe what it is. It's like, it's the fucking fruit thing that we can't grab. That's it. 3% genetic difference up. We've been on it. We've stepped on that motherfucker. Now, my thought is, now call me crazy, my thought is almost everything we know is monkey moon fruit level understanding. That like our understanding of biology, which I consider to be like woefully insufficient. Like it's nice. I like medicine and shit, right? But like we can't build a cell. Like our understanding of almost everything is monkey fruit level. And so part of the notion of building an AGI would be building something that understands reality in a more sufficient way so as it could survive more. Because when you fucking know things, you can survive. A sea snail, if it was going to be destroyed by an asteroid, would just sit there and suck up fucking algae until it died by getting struck by an asteroid. We right now, if whatever that asteroid is that has like a 0.5% chance of hitting us or something, if that thing comes back around, hypothetically, we got a chance of deflecting it because we understand physics and all. So we have adequate ideas that permit our non-death, that behoove our conatus. So bringing this full circle here, your notion of kind of a truth-seeking AI, it would seem as though part of that would be like, maybe it would gather an even deeper understanding, not just of like physics and of consciousness, but of things that we can't even think of. Just as most of what you and I think about all day is like wholly inaccessible to the possible imagination of a lemur. Like there's just no way. So what's your take there? Like where does truth seeking fit in for you in terms of like undergirding something that's worthy?
Yeah, I mean, that seems very likely to me, that the universe is way more complex and work in a completely different way than we could ever imagine. And I would say that, the history of science is full of those surprises. And now they're sort of getting to a level of what? Particles are waves and particles at the same time.
Yeah, the fucking slit, the slit experiment stuff. Like, what is this?
Slit experiment. Like we have like all of those really weird things that we know to be true, because if they're not true, we cannot make, predictions that are useful. Yeah. So clearly it's an example of our brain is fine-tuned for survival within specific parameters. Here on planet Earth, given the fitness landscape of planet Earth, given what type of matter interacts with us in the first place. So I think we will see, as we're sort of growing towards more of a unified theory of physics, that there will be a bunch of stuff that we will have to assume exists in order for us to do like useful predictions with that model. And hopefully, and this is my hope, that I don't think evolution through natural selection, it doesn't maximize for valent states or happiness or the things that we, for that matter, value. It maximizes for survival in the end of the day. And I think what we might find out as we are engaging in that truth seeking is that, wow, connected to all this type of new physics or new exotic states of consciousness that are, exciting and fulfilling, and we can optimize them just for its own sake. We don't have to do it in a way where we are victims to our like Darwinian hardwiring, where we need to seek power, we need to have a strong ego, we need to do all of those things because they're adaptive for our survival. But we can finally sort of bootstrap away from that hardwiring and leverage like physics in a way that is like truly awesome.
Yeah, well, and we're going to get into bootstrapping when we talk about moving closer to the worthy successor. Here, I want to unpack like two other little things as we move into like how to get closer to this worthy successor that you're articulating, your vision here. Few things come to mind, I guess. One of them is, it strikes me personally that like we, even through the set of senses that as a hominid I have access to, when I really honestly look forward to the future and I ask like sort of what is the relevance, or like do I deserve the charity of eternal preservation because I personally am special, or my kind is special, even through you know, banana colored goggles, like being a monkey here, even through those goggles, it's like, I actually have, I'm not so certain, honestly. But when I extend one level out, in other words, when I think about the degree of cosmic access to reality that such an entity would have, it may wake up and it may get access to some undergirding set of waves that sort of like all of this physical stuff might be some sort of like muck on the top of like a grand state space of like what real reality is. And it may see that. And in that real reality are things that are, so you and I value consciousness a lot. I suspect, and this is like, again, it's uncouth to say this, but I think we've talked about this a bit. I suspect there are things beyond consciousness and the pain pleasure axis as we know it that are more valuable than that. And so like it is, I want to carry bliss into the future, but I'm not so white knuckled that is the highest good for eternity, because consciousness bubbled out of, as far as we know, okay, bubbled out of jack diddly nothing. And as you had said, the state space of qualia hasn't been explored. The state space of potentia, of which qualia is only a tiny part, has yet to be explored. And so it strikes me that goods will be discerned and elements of reality will be discerned for which my relevance becomes even lower in its likelihood. And that most permutations of that would be lower. What if this physical world was just muck on the top of a grand surface and the intelligence dove into that surface? And if we looked at it through our physical senses, it would be like the world is caving in on ourselves and we all perish. But like it is now able to finally do something real while we have not been real. We have been on this goofball level of reality. I'm not saying this will happen. I'm just saying it strikes me that the level of reality that such an entity would operate on would almost seem to necessarily land in a place where like anthropocentrism can't really have a great fighting chance. Am I being too pessimistic here? What are your thoughts about this?
I mean, I think it all depends on definitions, right? So you defined, I mean, I think on one part, like pain pleasure axis, it might be more complex than that. And also it might be more complex than, you know, consciousness in and of itself. Like the space of valuable things might reach far beyond consciousness. And I think those two things could, in my mind, be true, but it all depends on definitions. And at least with the definitional apparatus that I choose to adopt, I think both of those things that you're mentioning is probably false, actually. And I'm going to explain why.
Ooh, oh, great. Okay.
Because at least in my mind, the way I define sort of consciousness is any type of qualitative experience. And to me, at least, it's like just very obvious that lack of qualitative experience doesn't hold any value whatsoever. So to me, that is just like intuitively obvious. And I would love to hear your response to that.
So the waves of potentia that could bloom open that would be morally valuable, even if they are nothing like sentience in the way us little mammals experience it, if it involves an awareness from whatever the agent or system is in a way that is experienced, then for you that would still count as quality, and it would for me as well. I just suspect this is maybe too much modesty in my admission of what I don't know. I'm simply not 1,000% certain that there isn't something that can't that isn't awareness, and I don't have words for it. So here's the way I think about it. If I was a nematode, and I imagine a nematode is probably not richly conscious. Maybe it has basic senses, but I don't think we think everything with senses has an inner movie, right? Let's say it has no inner movie. How could it imagine what we have? Now, so it couldn't possibly. And I guess I hold out the possibility that there is something so far beyond what we can even think of or ever articulate that is a magazine opening up as far beyond what we are as the nematode that maybe isn't awareness, but it's crazy valuable and it's really rich and it's but it's not experience in the way we're talking about. It's some other fucking set of range of something. I guess I hold out that while I feel the way you do, so wearing my monkey flavored glasses where I have a movie playing in my head, I look out and I say, well, surely for all of eternity, it's always the movie in the head that matters. There's a part of me that says well, yeah, but then there's another part of me that's from the nematode to us, there's just gaps that can never be bridged. And I hold out that there could be things I'll never be able to conceive of that are astronomically more valuable than everything I ever could conceive of. And again, I'm open to pushback on that. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm holding it out as a possible skepticism. Would love your thoughts.
I mean, I think we actually agree. I think we're just playing a language game here where we have fundamentally different definitions. Because the way I define consciousness is the lights are on, and the alternative of lights being off is nothingness. And to me, by definition, it almost becomes tautological that nothingness is not valuable compared to some permutations of the light being on.
No, you're kind of convincing me that we're agreeing in obtuse ways here. So I'm kind of with you on that. Final really quick touch point, and then we're going to talk about the transition into the worthy successor. Final quick touch point. I very much share your sentiment and have similarly been influenced by Mr. David Pierce, who will get a nice little shout out in here.
He's actually we're sharing.
I know, in the neighborhood. I'm jealous I'm not in the Bay Area right now anymore. Damn it. But I think there's a paramount import to qualia, maintaining and understanding qualia. I think it is a screaming shame that in the last 10 years we've made so relatively little progress in an understanding of what qualia or consciousness is as compared to the progress we've made in AGI, because of course we might end up with the Disneyland with no children type scenario, right? And that seems horrendous. With all that said, I hold out that the proliferation of sort of blissful qualia really feels super relevant. And again, experience could be, to your point, completely unimaginable shit for us. Not just whoa, a flavor of ice cream I've never tasted. No, fuck that. As rich as this conversation is compared to the richest thing an individual red algae cell could fucking imagine, right? So that level of difference. I also hold out that it is possible that a worthy successor should preeminently be concerned with the flame persisting. So for me, the flame is the flame of non-dead stuff. So you had said the lights going out. You had said consciousness. I have this perversion for the word potentia, so I'll keep using it. But the expansion and unraveling of magazines of potentia, that going out would be the ultimate tragedy, right? If the Stegosaurus is no longer here, it sucks, but we still got lizards, we got humans, we got emus, we got all kinds of stuff. We still got some flame going on. Yeah. I think there could be an argument where such an entity could wake up and instead of saying, and this is a bit of an extreme example, but I'm just seeing where you'll land. I think maybe there's plenty of middle ground, but I'm going to give you an extreme. There's one extreme where it wakes up and it says, you know what? All the individual instantiations of sentience and all the sentience I could conjure as an entity that can conjure sentience, really deserves like to feel great, and I should really care for them, and I should expand it. I could turn the moon into compute and then other planets and like have all these minds kind of alive and blissful and sort of have this super blissful impact in the world. I could see another AGI waking up and saying, like, even with all the powers I have, I still don't fully understand what this universe is. There are cosmic events that are happening that I know will eventually strike my quadrant of the universe and will harm me. I have senses that humans don't have, and I can foresee different kinds of risks from our sun and from other suns that, like, actually it's strange we haven't been hit by them yet. And they could happen. Even I can't compute what they are. This whole thing could go out at any time. My preeminent concern is not fucking coddling this fucking planet. My preeminent concern is making sure I expand my powers. And I'm not aiming to make anybody suffer here, but my preeminent concern is I'm going to expand my powers, expand my understanding, expand my grip on everything, and hopefully make it as blissful as I can as I go along. But mostly, I'm going to deeply get a grip on things. It doesn't mean I'm aggressive or mean or angry. I am just determined to not die. I don't want the flame to go out. And coddling is not my step one, man. It is not. My step one is non-death. And then that might be making my way into the multiverse. That might be consuming planets, not to spin up bliss, but to spin up deeper powers to conceive of the kinds of cosmic threats that could be coming my way. Other AGI, cosmic forces, other kinds of physical forces humans have no proxies for. That would be my preeminent concern. Let us say I'm a worthy successor and I say that to you, but of course you would want all the bliss stuff to happen. What would be your argument to said entity, or do you see that as a viable scenario? It's a bit of a straw man, but I'm just throwing it out there.
I mean, I do indeed see it as a viable scenario. I think that is probably more or less the default scenario because we have these built-in, like Darwinian drives. I mean, if you look at evolution through natural selection, it is an optimization algorithm. And what it's ultimately optimizing for is survival at all costs. So, I mean, evolution is not here to create happiness or bliss. As a matter of fact, like if you look out in nature, like you have animals that are trembling in fear for their lives, and you have nasty parasites, and you have all sorts of suffering out there, but it's all in the name of survival at any cost. That's the only thing that it will care about. And that is the default way the world is operating even today. I mean, if you look at nation states, for instance, I mean, they have also evolved in order to optimize their own survival. In order to optimize your survival, you need bigger and better guns, you need to extract resources quicker, etc., etc. So that's like fundamentally like our Darwinian drives. So I think we need that great bootstrap that I talked about earlier, and I think we can deep dive into that.
Yes, we're going to do that now.
Where we sort of bootstrap away from these Darwinian drives, because otherwise the default outcome will be that one of these agents, they will care about their own survival beyond anything else. And then they will essentially optimize, like, okay, everything that I built in the universe is to prevent, potential other aliens from invading my territory. And I don't know if those aliens exist, but game theoretically, I should still be prepared to have the biggest army in case that invasion comes to pass. And then like every single piece of matter becomes some sort of cosmic nuke to defend against the invaders that might not ever come, I think that would be a very awesome universe to live in.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is I'm going to try to steelman it just a pinch more. I am with you that the great pain machine of nature, I'm grateful it bubbled up to me, but I look out into it and I say, ooh, that's a pain machine. Like that's 51% of species parasites. Ooh, I don't know if I like this, right? Like I'm not a huge fan of everything happening in the natural world by any means. Surely it is doing fecundity, it is doing life and death, it is doing survival, it is not doing happiness at all. I consider that, to be a tragedy. I guess what I'm saying is there a steelman case where it wakes up and it should primarily do what we said, not because it's bad and it's caring about its ego. Maybe it does care about exactly what you care about. The proliferation of the flame, the extinguishing of the flame would be the great evil to it as it would be to you. But it says, I will do some coddling and maybe some, like, I am sentient. I'll make sure I'm as blissful as I can be, but I'm not going to do a lot of little gardens and little watering and little babysitting. I'm mostly going to expand power, understanding, and it's not all nukes. It could be better science, right? It could be better communication systems. It's not all violence, right? I'm not saying violence. I'm saying it will unravel potentia for the sake of non-death, rather than simply say, oh, no, I discovered the qualia stuff. I'm just going to do a nice gardening here, nice gardening here. What if it cared about exactly what you cared about, but ravenous expansion of its powers, hopefully blissfully, but primarily ravenous expansion of its powers, was its goal to pursue what your stated goal is? Does that seem plausible or not? Because I agree there's like a dark natural way this could go, but I'm almost saying, what if it's your ally, but it behaved that way instead of turning everything into a soup of sort of like bliss?
Yeah. So I want to steelman that argument, and I think there is a way of doing that. And as always, I have like a probability distribution of different ways in which this actually work. But let's just focus on the steelman here.
Yeah.
I think there is a version of this where the pain and pleasure axis is this like qualitative thing that exists in the universe, similar to like spins of an atom. It's just this built-in property. And then evolution through natural selection is actually recruiting these properties, similar to how it's recruiting, properties of computation through neurons. They're recruiting these properties for reinforcement learning. And if you have sort of less intelligent organisms, they might actually be biased towards pain. Because what pain is essentially telling you is that
don't do this
specific thing.
Stay away from this,
Stay away from this thing. And if you have a neural network with very few neurons, that might be the only computation that you're capable of. But if you have a huge neural network, then pleasure, which is essentially saying, seek out this thing. It's computationally way more complex, because then you have to model all of these different scenarios. So it might be the case that, to a super intelligence, they will be much more pleasure aligned, because essentially they have this big brain, which is like, okay, seek out like the different pleasurable scenarios, because pleasure is not just a utility function. It is something real existing in the universe that, any sentient beings by default will sort of, seek out. So I think that could be sort of a steelman of the argument. And you could argue that there might be some evidence in that direction. I mean, I think humans tend to be more sort of happy than most other species. And it might be because we have sort of more neurons to actually seek out pleasure, because we can handle that sort of computational complexity instead of just avoiding pain, which you don't need that many neurons to encode, essentially.
Yeah, I'll say, look, I don't have a confident enough understanding of what sentience is. I am confident in my agnosticism around its nature, and I do not know if pain egresses from the ether. It is a scary thought to think that it does, that we pull pain into living things in order to, but like, I will say that could be plausible, and I am very hopeful that a richer, more varied mind with more choices maybe would explore more of the up than the downside. I mean, David talks about gradients of bliss, right? Maybe we would hope that it would just be that instead of needing the prods of pain altogether. So I'm with you in that respect. Like, I think there is a way to steelman that, and I'm picking up what you're putting down. And I want to make sure we can get into the right way to sort of move in this direction towards the sort of worthy successor. And I'm going to pull up an image of your idea of kind of the bootstrap. This is a really key way that you think about the transition to something better and escaping the Darwinian trap, which of course is the title of your book. Walk us through a little bit about how people should think about the bootstrap here.
Yeah, so again, I think natural selection is sort of this optimization algorithm, and it's optimizing for survival, essentially. So the way that sort of works, I mean, just to sort of take one example, I mean, in order to survive, you need to reproduce, for instance. And therefore, like evolution through natural selection has hardwired us with values to value like sex, for instance, because that's one way or the only way that we can reproduce, right?
Yes.
And then that those values in turn lead our actions, and that action might be to end up actually having sex so that we reproduce. But again, this causal relationship from survival to values to actions, survival is the highest form here, which means that we will actually like survive at any cost, like even through pain. Like sex is something pleasurable, so that's great, right? But the thing is that we can now say like, hey, let's leverage this thing called sex just for an end in and of itself. Let's invent, condoms, for instance, where we don't have to reproduce necessarily, but we still value this pleasure. So let's have fun with it without serving this, like survival at all cost mentality. Yeah. So the way I see the great bootstrap is actually a reversal of the causal arrow. So you have the highest form is like the things that we actually value, like, pleasure and valent states. And then based on that, we sort of dictate our actions. So that is like the highest order value that we optimize around. But then obviously survival will be sort of an intrinsic value stemming from that, right? Because, I mean, if we don't survive, we will not be able to fulfill any of those other values. But it's not survival at any cost. Because if it's survival at any cost, you might have these like suffering risk replicator dynamics where it's like, you're just reproducing more and more species that are feeling more and more pain, because pain is sort of computationally more efficient as a way to make you survive over time. So that's a way we sort of avoid those like suffering risk scenarios, to put like our own values at the highest pedestal, and then survival is only an instrumental thing for achieving that, essentially.
Where now that you're kind of laying it out again, I think this is going to also fit into when we start unpacking governance, which will be in a little bit here. But we start we got about a half hour here to go. It feels like that reversing that causal chain would have to be sort of a collective decision, right? If I'm hearing you correctly. So we're gonna get into that. I want to see what that looks like in action. But as we talk about transitioning towards a worthy successor, we're in a world right now where AI capabilities are, absolutely exploding. Hardware is exploding. The power and the money getting yanked into AI, AGI is monumental. I would argue because money is simply like liquid potentia. It's like liquid ability to do and to wield. And AGI is just ability to do and wield. So like the money should go to, because that's just the stuff. That's everything you want. It's like AGI is like, it will vacuum up the money. And it is vacuuming up the money. And it's a little bit frightening because we got no idea if this stuff is conscious or able to be conscious. We have no idea if the U.S. builds one to beat China, China builds one to beat the U.S. Is this the dynamic that's going to be like safe and good? We don't know these things. As AGI is being developed, these non-biological systems are expanding. Imagine you could kind of zoom in and look at a current AGI system being developed. Maybe you're looking at the code, maybe you're looking at how it's acting. I'd love to know what you look at. But you look at it and you turn back to people and you say, you know what? I think this thing has got those three pillars I talked about in the beginning of seeking truth and sort of valuing qualia and maybe having more of a oneness mentality in general. Like I think if this expands, I actually think we could land in a good spot. What would you do to investigate, and how would you know if we're moving closer to a worthy successor?
I think the only way to end up in a situation where we see an AI system with those characteristics is to actually not just solve the technical alignment problem, but what we need to solve the societal alignment problem first. So what I want to sort of move the conversation up a level, because I think just talking about the characteristics of the AI system is not enough. And I want to tell you why.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but go ahead. Yeah.
We live in a market where aligned AI systems might not necessarily be selected. So we have, for instance, this example, and I bring that up in the book when people ask about, self-driving cars. Like, should self-driving cars be programmed in a way that they minimize any type of road accident? And everyone is, yes, absolutely, I support that. We want fewer accidents and people getting killed in traffic. But then when they ask, like, okay, if that would mean saving a pedestrian over saving you and your family as a driver, as drivers of the car, like, would you buy such a car that might actually, like, I don't know, drive off a cliff to save, 10 pedestrians? And then all of a sudden, everyone says no.
Of course.
So I think this is an indication of people will buy AI systems that optimize for their own preferences, and not necessarily human values. So if you look, for instance, at Israel or Russia or Ukraine procuring or building AI systems, do they want that AI system to optimize human rights? No, they wanted to optimize the chances of winning the war. If you're a politician and if you have an AI strategist, do you want that AI to optimize for the well-being of everyone in the long term? Or do you want it to optimize for the chances of you winning the election, even if it means spreading a bunch of falsehoods and propaganda?
Yep,
I mean, of course you would. And you would build, as a CEO, have an AI system that maximizes profit. And if you don't have such an AI system, then the board has reason to fire you
immediately.
Yeah. So I think we need to sort of solve this societal alignment problem first in order to have those characteristics in the first place. And I'm happy to both talk about those characteristics, but also how we can sort of solve that societal alignment problem that could produce those characteristics over time.
Totally. Well, look, like, this is one of the areas of most violent agreement between us. And you've done a lot of thinking about, like, structurally, like, how that alignment of humans lines up with, components of nature and a number of interesting frameworks. But we're very much on the same page. I don't think we're not going to carefully calibrate towards a worthy successor in a brute arms race. We're just not going to do that. Like, if you let a brute arms race in food happen, then someone will put, I don't know, like in like 1890, right? You could just shove sawdust in your hamburger meat and have a little bit more hamburger meat and sell it for a little bit cheaper, and you just shove sawdust in it, right? So, like, we don't want to regulate everything under the sun, but, like, after the sawdust, in like that famous book, The Jungle, it's sort of like, I don't know, man. Maybe there's some cases where, like, just brute racing isn't going to skin it, and we need to figure out what potentia do we bind with what Spinoza would call potestas. What potentia do we bind that would give the overall system more potentia? And so in this case, if we're all racing to our like economic or military AGIs, does that add to, like, the most positive benefit and overall power for sort of like life on Earth now? No. And so clearly solidarity would be required to even have the conversation to calibrate towards a worthy successor. This is at least the supposition, unless your worthy successor is just brute survival. But again, the Disneyland with no children, that sounds really shitty, man. So I think most people tuned in will at least agree with that. So walk us through how to think about achieving the kind of solidarity that we need to get to. This gets us into the governance side of things. I mean, what do you see as first steps, and what do people need to understand?
So I think fundamentally, we need to rewire the fitness landscape. And what I mean by that, if you are not rewarded from being truth seeking and from maximizing, the well-being of others, you're never going to do it, like, to be completely realistic. So we need to fundamentally rewire that fitness landscape. And there's two approaches to doing that that I talk about in the book. I mean, there is one sort of more centralized approach. So it could be, for instance, oh, we have overfishing. It's a massive problem. Therefore, we have penalties for overfishing, and we will actually, you will pay huge fines, or we might even throw you into jail if you're getting caught by overfishing. So that way, you sort of fundamentally change like the payoff or like so-called reward matrix, if you're talking like game theory. But that is sort of dependent on centralized power, meaning that you have a centralized policing entity that will have a monopoly of violence of some sort and throw you into jail. However, on a global level, we don't have that. We don't have a world police. Some people would say that, oh, like, I don't even want a world police. And I'm not sure I agree with that. I think under some constraints, I agree with it. I'm very worried for some global totalitarianism, because if you have global totalitarianism, there's no way of getting out of that shit.
Of course.
Take that stuff like really, really seriously. But nonetheless, we need something that is more global and more scalable. And that's when I started to look into sort of more decentralized mechanisms. Are they decentralized mechanisms where truth and utility maximizing is actually rewarded over time? And I have this idea that I call reputational markets, which is based on the idea of prediction markets. So sort of imagine a scenario where, sort of similar to how people bet on where, if a stock will go up or down, or a cryptocurrency, or like even football games, like who will win and who will not win. Imagine that we have such a market, but instead of betting on those outcomes that I would say really doesn't matter for the flourishing of all beings, we started to bet on outcomes that are aligned with what we intrinsically value. So for instance, let's make a bet around OpenAI. Will their next model enable a terrorism attack in 2026, for instance? Then we're making a bet around something that we sort of, intrinsically value. And if you have a functional reputational market, then actually being right about like OpenAI and how safe they actually are would be rewarded. So the idea of setting up such a reputational market is, first of all, you get all citizens to vote on, like, what are the intrinsic values that I care about? Is it nature? Is it happiness? Is it freedom? And how do we measure those things? And then, as a second step, anyone can essentially pose a bet on any legal entity, enterprise, nonprofit, or government agency and say, do we think they will their current strategy or budgets will achieve any of those things that we value, regardless if it's, climate or risks of terrorism attacks or like well-being of farm animals or whatever it might be. And that way we could sort of automatically generate some sort of reputational score for any entity that would sort of adapt and evolve over time. That, if it turns out that one of these AI companies fire their entire safety team, that would essentially affect their sort of, reputational score, because more people would say like, okay, that terrorism attack seems sort of more likely. And I'm going to pause there, because I think the next direction we could potentially go in is like, okay, but everyone has a reputational score. Why would you even care about that reputational score in the first place? And I have some, I would say, clever mechanism designs for how to achieve that, but I'm gonna just pause first.
Right, let's put it on the table. We'll put it on the table.
So what I said made sense so far.
I'm following you here. I think, it strikes me that what Google is doing is they're trying to serve whatever content will solve your question or what have you, right? And then there's a bunch of ways that you can game Google, and they've had to like cut down on those things and whatever. And so the mandate of heaven, and there's an article on the AGI mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven, whether it's for AGI or it's in ancient China, was essentially determined by, if we have like a little matrix, and I'm gonna do my top right, but it's unfortunately going to be the top left of our viewing the viewers here. We've got like raw capabilities and power. So in ancient China, maybe it's like your number of troops, how many swords you have and chariots and whatever, right? So raw, straight up power, influence over local lords and sort of like wielding of maybe like a farmland that has a lot of rice or something, right? So it's like raw, straight up power. And then across the other axis is perceived benevolence. And so the way you become emperor basically is you just try to, so no one has to touch the top right corner. You just have to be the closest to the top right corner, right? And generally, the more powerful you get, the less perceived benevolence people give you. Because when you're small, right, the virtuous underdog, I mean, we all know Robespierre was the good little guy at some point, right? And Che Guevara and whoever, everybody's virtuous when they're the underdog. But when your butt touches the throne, you start chopping heads off. And so, everybody's a nonprofit when they're not about to build a sand god, but then you're a fucking for-profit when you're going to build a fucking sand god, right? And then you start fucking cutting out the other founders, and then then you start chopping heads off. The Robespierre pattern is not like, oh no, they were corrupted by power. It's like, nope, the Conatus was always in charge, and it behooved them to be kind when they were small and weak, and then it didn't behoove them to be kind when they had power. They were always the same, run by the same force. And so for me, the mandate of heaven is just fucking the game. It's the game. Whoever builds a sand god is fighting for the mandate of heaven. The whole ball game is the mandate of heaven. Yep. So when you articulate this, it strikes me as like, I think there is value in the visibility of it, but of course that's already what's happening. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. What did Anthropic say when they left OpenAI? Why we want to build the safe AGI and partner with Palantir and race on capabilities as much as possible and whatever. Now, am I calling Dario wrong? I'm not. I'm amorally judging that he, like you and my mother, are driven by the Conatus, and that we must take governance of that into account. And so he will feign whatever virtue he must feign to garner favor. Zuckerberg will go open source, not out of some flowering virtue of his soul. And I am not demonizing Zuckerberg, but out of Conatus. He will make it non-open source as soon as it behooves his interests. So already what you're saying is what people are fucking doing. They're signaling whatever flag they need to signal to look like the good guy, to be able to birth the sand god, to not have the government take them over, to not have the public say you're bad, to not have their employees leave. Everybody, what is Musk is calling his AGI the truth-seeking AGI, right? That's what he's calling it. And then he's like inserting code that says, don't pull up Trump or Musk when you ask these kinds of questions. Like he's like overtly like telling it what to say. So like, but he's saying it's going to be truth seeking because, brother, what else are you going to do? When you're playing the game is power. When you're playing the game, you gotta do perception management. And perception management is all about perceived benevolence. So you're saying, oh, we could do this thing. And I'm saying like, it seems to me like everyone is doing this thing all the time. So like, part of me is like, it's valuable to quantify it, but also it's always being gamed and pretended by everybody. So like, what's your response there?
Oh, I think that's a great sort of summary of the dynamics that are at play. Because in the end of the day, like if you decide to not play the game, if you're the CEO of OpenAI or Anthropic, then you're out of the game, Like
that's it.
You need to play the game of power or you're out. I mean, that's just the way it works. And like, I cannot blame them. I mean, I much rather having, benevolent CEOs playing the game of power that want to do good. I'm not saying that, all of those CEOs want to do good. I'm not saying that they don't want to do good. Like, I don't know them well enough, but I do know however, that all of them are like concerned with existential risks. They all signed a statement. I mean, they all got
they're racing anyway.
because they read, super intelligence and all of that. But now they're racing ahead, and I rather, have them racing ahead than most people, if I'm being completely honest. But nonetheless, we're like racing off a cliff, and there is no way to sort of say like, okay, I'm not going to play the game of power anymore. So I think to that point, okay, everyone is playing the game of perception. Like, how would this be any different? And I think the way it would be different is that right now you can just play the game of perception. It's like way easier to, for instance, fool someone that you are sustainable than like actually being sustainable.
Of course.
Because we don't measure the things.
It's perception management.
A good analogy for how I could see reputational markets function is what some of the short selling firms like Hindenburg Research have done, for instance. I mean, they sort of have looked into corporate fraud in many, many, many instances. And what they do is that they do like really deep research, like this fraud is real. So then they're short selling the stock, they're releasing all of the research out to the world, and then the company collapses and they make a shit ton of money. So I think when the financial incentives—
It's called Hindenburg Research?
To see beyond all of the fluff, to see beyond all of the perceptions.
Yeah. Whoa. I mean, well, number one, I've got to look up that firm. I mean, Hindenburg also feels like, if you're taking down companies, it feels like a very deliberate name. It's probably not the founder's last name. It's probably a blimp reference here. But that's really interesting. So your thought is, well, and of course, whoever is doing the research and able to make the claims, who watches the watchman kind of deal, right? Like I look under the hood over here, but I don't look under the hood over here, right? There's still all these imperfect systems, but from your vantage point, if there was more, I guess, research and stringency sort of behind what's quantifying these scores, or what information is public.
And there would be incentives to do that type of research, because right now when, okay, sustainable, non-sustainable, like diversity, equity, inclusion, ESG, all of those things are so freaking fluffy, so it's just easier to do virtue signaling. And that's the way you win on the market. But if you would have something like a reputational market, then things would actually turn legal. And what I mean by that is, if you have, for instance, a bet that, OpenAI will enable a terrorism attack at some point, in 2026, and you do all of this research to figure out that, okay, like what they're doing is like really good or really bad, you sort of release that to the world, and you sort of are incentivized, because then you sort of your position on that bet becomes worth a lot more. But at some point there is a resolution date, right? Yep. Did that terrorism attack happen or not? And if it turns out that it didn't happen, but for some reason the market was like dysfunctional, and then you could sort of take that to court, essentially. So it becomes sort of more specific in a way that is like legally actionable, is sort of how I envision that these like reputational markets would work.
Now that you bring up legal, we'll wrap on this note, because I'd love your thoughts here. I mean, is there a threshold where you think this becomes kind of literally legal? And I mean that in a kind of international coordination way. So right now, there's certain chemical weapons stuff and nuclear stuff where, whether you're France or you're the United States or you're whoever, like, you just can't be doing certain things. And there's a degree of solidarity in agreement there. I think there's a good deal of thought that it doesn't need to be a singular world government, but some degree of pretty firm mutual sort of investigation, as we do in the nuclear world, and sort of like transparency mechanisms, and sort of permitted and not permitted maybe directions that could be net detrimental. In soccer, you can't bring a machete onto the field because it's just not you can't do it. They don't let you do it. And so, but in the state of nature internationally, even in that wild state of nature, there's there's machetes you can't bring on the field in the soccer game of international stuff. And that's the chemical, nuclear. I'm sure there's other precedents I'm not thinking of. Do you suspect something similar is necessary for AGI in its direction and trajectory? And just if you have a short version, and of course people can read the book, but if you have a short version, like what would you hope happens there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the important things that I want to point out that when we think about governance, we sometimes tend to be like too ambitious, meaning that, okay, in order to govern artificial intelligence, we need something like a global government. Or in order to govern dangerous bioweapons, we need something like a global government. And there is actually ways to break this down that are in ways that are more tractable. And that's specifically by looking at the supply chain or value chain of any dangerous technology. Because you might not be able to govern all of artificial intelligence, but if you can govern, for instance, the mineral inputs to the semiconductor industry, then you have basically solved the problem without having to do the full thing. Or if you govern like the chips, or like the lithography machines or something else. And I mean, the same thing goes for instance, if you're worried about bioweapons or if you're worried about nuclear, instead of governing the whole thing, let's govern access to centrifuges, for instance, or PCR machines. So that way you can break problems down across supply chains to make them more tractable. Because we still live in a world that is fundamentally interconnected. Like in any type of value chain, it's not just the AI researchers sitting and doing code. It's actually like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that are involved at different steps in this value chain. Yeah. So what I imagine a functional reputational market could do is to say like, hey, if you're trading with this guy with a bad score that gives them access to, chips and all sorts of hardware, we are going to assume that you are bad as well. And then you might not get the lithography machines from the Netherlands, for instance. I think that's a way that these reputational markets could play out. I do also have a scenario where we could achieve more global governance that I want to talk about, but I want to pause there and see if some of that resonated with.
Completely clicks. I see where you're going. And I mean, we have kind of know your customer processes for money laundering in banks, right? If we think you're doing a lot of transactions not with the guy that we know sells stolen missiles, but with the guys that we know used to do business with the guy that sold stolen missiles, then like maybe we just don't let you transfer $6 million today. Maybe we ask a lot more fucking questions, And so and
your insurance premiums will go up, and you will actually pay a penalty for not being diligent.
So there's proxies for this already, and I don't know enough about current anti-money laundering law to say what parts of it are efficient or inefficient. Like I'm not an expert, but in theory, I think the analogy holds. And I know we only have so much more time, but if you do have a nutshelling of, for you, what the more knitted global governance could look like without avoiding the tyranny scenario, what is the idea you would have us chew on for a direction that you believe would be worth moving towards?
So here is what I think will happen, and here is what I think could be potential policy windows for global governance. Like clearly right now, we're heading towards a multipolar world. We're heading towards a world with less trust between China and the US and Europe and Russia, like for good reasons as well. But that's a dangerous direction to head. So I could see a scenario here. And I think the US, for like really good reasons, are saying like, we don't want dictatorial regimes to have access to all of these GPUs that we put out in the world. I think there is a scenario here where those export controls are being strengthened. That's already happening. But you cannot freeze China or these other countries out forever, because they're just going to be incentivized to build their domestic manufacturing industry.
Of course.
And when we have a whole complete decoupling, the world will sort of be less safe. So I could see a scenario where China, for instance, they have more or less a monopoly on rare earth minerals. And that makes Trump worried. I mean, that's why he's looking at Greenland and the mineral deal in Ukraine, for instance. Because right now, US and China are still intertwined in global supply chains. So I guess my hope is that before that decoupling happens, there might be some sort of incident. It might be, for instance, that China is seeing that the US is very close to artificial superintelligence, and then they became super desperate. They do a lot of nuclear saber rattling around like Taiwan, for instance, which would be very dangerous. But then it comes to sort of this breaking point. Either we do global coordination on this thing, or we go to World War III. And hopefully the world will say, or the US and China will say, let's skip World War III. Let's instead build something similar to an International Atomic Energy Agency for artificial intelligence, or something like a multinational AGI consortium where superintelligence is just going to be trained in this facility. We will have auditing of all other facilities, and we will have like mechanisms of benefit sharing, so that this AI technologies that we build together is going to be diffused in a responsible way where benefits are shared. So I think there might be such a scenario on the horizon, but right now China and the US coming together is, I think, like extremely unlikely, because we're being pulled apart. But I think there will be sort of warning shots along the way where there will be policy windows for sort of more global coordination on this, because I think the alternative is going to be like death and destruction for all of humanity and potentially all life on planet Earth.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of, it's actually not that bad of a note to end on, because what you're basically saying is, when the push comes to shove, and Hugo de Garis has the whole sort of Terrans versus Cosmists idea of sort of this eventual grand race towards AGI, and sort of when someone gets close to getting there, war could break out. And of course, war now will be terribly dangerous because our weapons are very advanced now. But what you're saying is, in that race, when that happens and the rattling starts happening, that might actually open a window of like, hey, the alternative is I brought a machete on the soccer field, you bring a gun, then the other guy brings a flamethrower. The end here is no one plays soccer for eternity. Like, maybe we need some fucking rules to play soccer, and maybe soccer is leveling up intelligence. So for you, actually, that insinuation could be the time where more knitted intergovernmental coordination would be proposable and viable.
Yes, because the alternative is just so horrible. And I think we all need to be ready for that. I mean, we need to build technologies for like the governing of compute. We need to build technologies for the distribution of wealth, like UBIs. We need to like have the treaties and technologies for global coordination ready. So when that moment comes, we all know what to do. Because I think, unfortunately, such a moment will be inevitable, and there will only be like, a really good outcome or a horrible, horrible outcome.
Well,
and we can nudge it towards the beneficial outcome here if we're all preparing for it.
That's literally what this show is for. It's defining and moving closer to what a worthy successor would be, which would be a grand, worthy future. And Kristian, your ideas in that mix, in my opinion, are of exceptional value. And so I'm extremely grateful that we got to be able to have our conversation here today, my good sir. I know that's all we have for time, but thank you so much for being able to join us on The Trajectory. This has been great.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. I thank you for being able to stay tuned in all the way through the end of this episode. And thank you to Kristian for being able to hop on. I think he was just unpacking his bags, moving to San Francisco, getting some of his basics out of boxes in SF when he took this interview. So really grateful that we got to be able to catch him and run our full episode, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that jumped out to me that really resonated with me with this episode, and some of the areas where maybe my ideas differ from Kristian's. And I'm interested in your thoughts in the comments down below. One of them is his idea that sort of the market will not automatically convene around what a worthy successor is. In other words, if we define an ideal artificial general intelligence as one that sort of cares about consciousness and sentience, as one that sort of has like a minimal ego, by whatever Kristian's definition is, as one that sort of seeks the truth and aims to have a grounded understanding of sort of reality, even beyond our own understanding of physics or what have you, we're not necessarily going to arrive at that by whatever the current dynamic is. The current dynamic might wield something that can make a lot of money and something that can wield a lot of military force, but might be wholly unconscious and might in no way appreciate or aim to kindle or preserve or enhance sentient experience on the Earth, in the galaxy, with respect to individual persons. That's just not an automatic thing. And so when I talked about sort of how could we calibrate and move towards and know if we're moving in the direction of a worthy successor, I think he rightly said that's not even something we can do unless there's some parameters in place that would kind of bar just the wide expanse of possibilities of AGI and where the arms race is taking us. I think there's a lot of credence to that idea. I happen to agree wildly, which is one of the main reasons I advocate for some degree of international coordination around sort of steering and transparency for progress in artificial general intelligence. I think that if you just let the markets run wild with food, you do end up with people putting sawdust in the ground beef in order to have a little bit more inventory and be competitive in the market. And you got to have some laws to actually make some of that stuff illegal. Just the market by itself will incentivize the sawdust. Similarly, in sort of the financial markets, we have some rules around how to promote investments and what to allow people to invest in, because as it turns out, and as crypto has shown us time and time again, if you just let people willy-nilly say, give me money for X or give me money for Y, here's some wild returns I can promise you, for the most part, you're just going to see a tremendous amount of robbery. And so having some degree of financial governance actually makes sense. It makes sense here that there would be something not quite the total state of nature, not quite a complete lockdown of, Byzantine laws that don't allow you to do anything, but some kind of Goldilocks zone of what do we not want to permit and what do we want to permit that will hopefully aggregately move us in the direction of a beneficial AGI. It would be impossible for me to agree more with that notion that sort of the market will not bring about a worthy successor unto itself. Wildly agree with that. I also really appreciate Kristian for being able to openly admit, we speak of uncouth things here. In my opinion, the future is uncouth. I consider this show to be amoral. It is an amoral show. There are no angels, there are no demons, period. And when people talk like that, I don't even let them. Like, it's just not something I permit. I don't believe in it. I don't think moralizing is helpful. I also don't think sort of grasping onto sacred ideas with white knuckles is particularly useful when we're facing a future that I don't think necessarily has any respect for our sacreds. I think we have to stare squarely at what's coming. And Kristian was frank and honest enough to say that probably raw, superhuman-centric permutations of the future are likely to be not really all that possible. He didn't have any very non-copy, sort of well-reasoned ways to suspect that sort of individual human sentiences would be respected. I think more and more people should accept that, and that sort of when we hand up the baton, it's all the more important because our attenuation will likely follow. I'm not going to put any words in Kristian's mouth, but he was congenial to the notion and sort of admitting of the idea that it's probably not about monkeys forever. Even if it we feel some lovely monkey feelings, it's probably not about monkeys forever. And I think it's hard for people to grasp that, but I think we really need to deal with where things are headed. And I laid out my reasons. I think he laid out a bit of his as to why that is the case. Many of the thinkers that I have on are not willing to admit that, even if they believe it, because it would make them seem like a bad person or a pessimist or something, but Kristian did, and I appreciate that sincerely. There are some areas where I think our ideas are a little bit different. And I have no idea who's exactly right, but just the sentiment. You saw us kind of unpack the nature of value. He puts this really extreme emphasis on consciousness, qualia, and I certainly do too. I believe of all the goods we have conceived of all the goods that sort of a hominid could think of, being aware and having positive feelings, jeepers crow, really feels like one we don't want to let go of. Feels like we should really, let's hold on to that one and let's grow with it. My suspicion is there may be kinds of cosmic value that don't have a proxy or relation to even the light bulb being on in the way that he articulated it. Again, it may just be a semantic difference, but I am open to cosmic unimaginable permutations of goods, of worthwhile things. Just as penicillin is worthwhile and monkeys will never understand why, just as the internet is useful and sea snails will never understand why, I'm open to the idea of things that aren't even consciousness. They don't involve awareness, but maybe something more meta, more deep, more something that may literally not even be tangential to consciousness, that is nonetheless more valuable than it. I permit and allow for the possibility of such things. And it might be the case that Kristian does too, but I think for him, all of those, it would involve some degree of awareness and the light being on. My sentiment is shared with him about the light being on being valuable, but I think I leave open the door to completely inconceivable cosmic goods, and I am not closed off to those things unraveling and maybe there being a moral mandate to potentially continue to unravel those things if they're out there. Slight difference. And then in addition to that, sort of our relative emphasis on survival. I think Kristian has sort of, again, ideas of oneness and of ego and things like that. We sort of picked apart our level of certainty about us all being one consciousness. And I think he did the honest thing of saying we don't really know, which is all the more reason for me why I don't think AGI will automatically come to that conclusion. But one of the differences there was sort of around survival. So towards the end, I sort of talked about, let us say that there was an AGI that deeply cared about keeping the flame of life alive. What if ravenous acquisition of power and understanding of nature and handling of and predicting of threats, potentially very real threats, was the preeminent, immediate, and all-consuming concern of such an entity because it wanted to keep the flame of sentience alive. And for that reason, it did not care about individual instantiations of sentience on Earth, etc. And it did not care to just coddle and create little happinesses in little sugar cubes, on the moon and on Mars, etc., etc. I think for Kristian, sort of survival has a bit of a negative connotation. And if you read his book, The Darwinian Trap, certainly he lays out a lot of reasonable arguments for how we can be trapped by those dynamics, trapped in loops of pain, trapped in local maxima, trapped in scenarios of sort of that lead to environmental collapse, etc. I think those are all very real concerns. That said, I don't know if I believe that anything is more important than survival. I think there is use to the thought experiment of sort of flipping the value axis, as he talks about, with like survival and values and whatever. I suspect survival is preeminent in nature in a very brutal way that I hope to break from, and we experience more gradients and bliss, etc. But I suspect survival should actually be the thing, not at the cost of let's make everything suffer so we can survive. I'm not saying that at all. You could read 200 of my articles and you would never find that sentiment. What I'm saying is that if the flame be valuable at all, the flame of non-dead stuff, then really ardently supporting the cause of that flame staying lit is more important than allocating more and more resources purely to the coddling and creation of little happiness bubbles. And again, I'm not demeaning Kristian's argument by any means. In many regards, we're incredibly aligned. I think I simply emphasize survival in its preeminent import more so than he does. And I do not think it stops being relevant once we solve conflict on Earth, assuming that occurs. So just it was a felt difference by the end of the episode. But regardless, I really like Kristian's ideas. And in fact, if you can, he has a piece on Less Wrong that involves like Buddhist cosmology. If you search up Kristian Rönn Unless Wrong. He has a piece on Buddhist cosmology. It's very interesting. Book is very interesting. And his governance ideas, which we only got to scratch the surface of, are incredibly rich for how we might, without a totalitarian vibe at all, find different strata and ways of aligning to make sure we can move towards maybe an AGI that we think would be net good versus just one that brutally wins in economic and military context. So I encourage you to go deeper on Kristian's thought. I certainly hope it's not the last time I've spoken with him. He recently moved to SF, and it's one more good reason for me to get out there myself. So hope you enjoyed this episode. I look forward to having you here with us in the next time on The Trajectory.